Hello and welcome, history buffs! My name is Nick Hodges, and in today's review, I'll be tackling Kingdom of Heaven. Set during the Crusades, this is the story of how the French blacksmith Balian leaves for the Holy Land, hoping to find salvation for himself and for the souls of his dead wife and child in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It is not long though before he finds himself swept up in an epic struggle between two of the great religions of the world, Christianity and Islam. Sadly, in spite of its great battle sequences and exotic settings, this abysmal film doesn't have a leg to stand on when it comes to even basic storytelling. Even less so in understanding its own complex history. What we are presented with is an extremely dumbed down and fictionalized version of the Crusades, where the writing has clearly been tailored to fit common misconception on the Crusades, rather than being based on some actual fucking history. And finally guilty for having quite possibly one of the worst written protagonists I have ever seen in a movie. This is Kingdom of Heaven. So Kingdom of Heaven is set between the Second and the Third Crusade, focusing primarily on the fall of Christian Jerusalem. But in order to truly understand the Crusades, it's important to go back to the roots of the first. For 400 years, the Byzantine Empire had been fighting a losing battle against the rising tide of Islam. Bit by bit, their territories were taken over the centuries, first by the Arabs, and then by a new dominant force in the region, the Seljuk Turks. After defeating the Byzantines in the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, the fiercely warlike Seljuks had conquered almost all of Anatolia. In desperation, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I dispatched messengers to Rome pleading for help. In 1095, Pope Urban II answered the call and rallied the knights of Europe to gather arms and march east to liberate their Christian brethren. What's more is that he declared that anyone who took up crusade would be completely remiss of their sins and allowed into heaven. This was an extremely attractive proposition, as these knights were fully aware that their constant warring with each other contradicted the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. Western Europe was tearing itself apart with its feudal wars, and this allowed Pope Urban to direct this violence away from Christendom and towards a potentially greater threat. Just a year later, 60,000 men took the cross, and they couldn't have picked a better moment to strike. By this point, the Muslims had fragmented into smaller kingdoms with no central leadership. The First Crusade carved a bloody path through the Holy Land, pillaging and slaughtering Muslims in droves, taking city after city before finally retaking Jerusalem in 1099. So when Kingdom of Heaven begins in 1184, it has nearly been 100 years since the Christians took the city of Jerusalem and formed the Crusader states. Things have changed from then, however, as the Muslims have united under a new leader called Saladin, whose armies now surround the Crusaders. For the moment, there is a tense peace between them, but it is one that will not last. Now, the most obvious thing about Kingdom of Heaven is its portrayal of Christian Europe. The opening text of the movie establishes that Europe is in a state of repression and poverty, painting a picture of how bleak and sufferable day-to-day life is for the common man. This is especially true with the colour grading chosen for the opening scenes, or more appropriately, the absence of colour we see. Instead, we get dull greys and cold blues, and this is all done to give the impression that Christian Europe is a dark, backward place, whilst the Muslim world is awash with bright and vibrant colours, and the markets are jostling with trade and commerce, obviously highlighting that the Muslim world is progressive and culturally advanced. This may have been an accurate representation of Europe prior to the First Crusade, but in 1184, which is the film's time period, this is completely ridiculous. Kingdom of Heaven completely ignores that Europe is going through the 12th century Renaissance. Things were actually on the up and up, and the standards of living, both culturally and economically, were at the very least equal to the Muslim world. Europeans in their homelands were no more repressed or poverty-stricken than Muslims were in theirs. There was a revival in classical literature and academic studying of philosophy, science, mathematics, and medicine, and a big reason for all of this was due to the Crusades. For the first time since the fall of the Roman Empire, Western Europe was connected once again to the Orient, where it was also flourishing under the golden age of Islam. The Muslims had rediscovered the ancient knowledge that the Greeks had left behind, and through great ingenuity made huge cultural and scientific advances of their own in Baghdad's House of Wisdom, Islam's answer to the Alexandria Library. So the Europeans who went on their pilgrimages to the Holy Land also took this knowledge back home, and the increased trade and commerce between the Muslims and the Byzantine Empire encouraged this cultural exchange of information in Western Europe and made it readily available to everyone. So it's clear that Kingdom of Heaven has some sort of agenda, but what is it? Well, it seems to me that this film is taking a moral stance, and not only refuses to affiliate any positive benefits that may have occurred because of the Crusades to Western civilization, but wants to brand the Crusades as truly motivated by only one thing. Here is the gist of what the film is trying to tell you.
I've given Jerusalem my whole life. Everything. First I thought we were fighting for God. Then I realized we were fighting for wealth and land. I was ashamed.
Aside from our main protagonists, the Christians are generally demonized to be warmongering barbaric thugs attacking defenseless Muslims, and their measure of cruelty is fueled even more so by their religious fanaticism.
There must be war. God wills it! God wills it! God wills it!
In contrast, the Muslims seem to be really reasonable, especially in this scene after Saladin's sister was just murdered by the Christians.
The Sultan demands the return of his sister's body, the heads of those responsible, and the surrender of Jerusalem.
Does he?
What answer do you return to Salah ad-Din?
This?
Noticing a pattern here yet? Let me sum it up for you. The film is trying to tell us that the Crusades were primarily an excuse to conquer and subjugate a peaceful Islamic civilization out of a lust for greed and power. What if I was to tell you that the Crusades can be seen as a legitimate response? You probably think I wasn't being very PC, but hear me out. Prior to the First Crusade, the Muslims had conquered and converted nearly 2/3 of the Christian world. Syria, Palestine, Mesopotamia, Egypt, North Africa, Sicily, and a big chunk of Spain and Portugal were all originally Christian lands. That's not even mentioning their invasion of France in 719 and sacking Rome, the capital of the Christian world, in 846. Far from being peaceful, Islamic civilization was extremely warlike and had full intentions to wipe out Christian civilization. The newly conquered Eastern Christians suffered terrible atrocities and oppression by their new Muslim rulers. Christian pilgrims were routinely slaughtered by the Seljuk Turks during their raids against the Byzantine Empire. So, I'm actually surprised that it took 400 years of Muslim aggression before the Crusades finally kicked off. However, I am not condoning what the Christians did either. There are many accounts during the First Crusade of Christians committing horrific atrocities on a massive scale and slaughtering Muslims in their tens of thousands. When the Crusaders finally took back Jerusalem, they slaughtered every Muslim they could find within the city walls. So my point is that this movie should not demonize one group and victimize another, especially since both groups were just as fucking brutal as each other. The character of Balian is so heavily fictionalized that he's almost unrecognizable from the historical figure he's based on. But funnily enough, that's not what bothers me the most in Kingdom of Heaven. It's rather simply this classic case of bad writing where the plot dictates the character rather than the character driving the plot. From a storytelling standpoint, there are just too many things that happen to Balian that doesn't make sense, and the film also seems to be tragically and laughably unaware of the basic medieval environment that contradicts Balian's story arc. Now, I'm guessing that Balian's origin was written to be a fish out of water story in order to introduce the audience to the world of the Crusades. He would be free to ask and have questions answered for him that audiences need to know.
What know you of Saladin?
That he is king of the Saracens, and that he surrounds this kingdom.
He has 200,000 men in Damascus alone. He could win a war if he goes to war. And he's daily given cause for war by fanatics newly from Europe. By Templar bastards like Renard de Chatillon.
You see, if you already knew this stuff and spent his whole life in Jerusalem like the real Balian of Ibelin, then they wouldn't be having this conversation. From a narrative perspective, this makes sense and usually works in other movies, but Kingdom of Heaven's historical setting and events run counter to Balian's journey as a character, and much of it stems from the simple fact that Balian is a blacksmith and above all, a bastard. The moment that Kingdom of Heaven really starts to fall apart is when Godfrey knights Balian.
Be without fear in the face of your enemies. Be brave and upright that God may love thee. Speak the truth, always, even if it leads to your death. Safeguard the helpless and do no wrong. That is your oath. And that's so you remember it.
Arise, the knight and Baron of Ibelin.
Okay, you've made him a knight. He's still a bastard and has no claim to your land and titles. Now, it's true that a knight can make another knight, but it would have been impossible for Godfrey to legitimize Balian as his successor. If Godfrey had no other male heirs next in line, then his land and titles would have reverted back to the king, who would then choose someone else in his court to be the inheritor instead. So this idea that with a swish of his sword, Godfrey could make Balian the next Baron of Ibelin is just bollocks. Another thing that is just hard for me to believe is just how accepting everyone is of Balian when he arrives in Jerusalem.
You're your father's son. He was my friend. I'm yours.
I loved your father, and I shall love you.
Keep in mind that this is the first time they've ever met Balian. They have no idea who this man is. Any assumption they might have of him is only based on the fact that he is Godfrey's son, and even Godfrey didn't really know Balian that well, or had anything to do with his upbringing. So I must stress that Balian is, by all accounts, a complete stranger to these people, and yet they welcome him with open arms.
If you continue like this, I shall have to find a use for you. If God can spare you, that is.
God does not know me.
Yes, but I do.
I'm sorry, Your Majesty, but no, you don't. This is only the second time you've ever met the guy. I would strongly recommend that you get to know him a little bit first before deciding on how to use him, or at least have a conversation with him that lasts longer than 5 minutes.
We have decided that you shall take command of the army of Jerusalem.
Really? Don't you want to, I don't know, perhaps look at his resume before making this important decision? Maybe get an idea of his qualifications before risking absolutely everything on him leading your fucking army. In fact, let's do that right now and see if he's fit to be a general. See, okay, there's that one time he trained with Godfrey.
Never use a low guard. You fight well. Let's work on your skills. Take a high guard, like this. The Italians call it La Posta di Falcone, the guard of the hook. You strike from high. Like this. Do it.
Which lasted just over 60 seconds. We don't see him do any other training, so I have to assume that was the extent of it. Still, I guess it came handy when he fought that guy's servant.
Fight me fairly!
What do you know? Why? Why should he? He is a knight.
And that one other time he led that suicide charge against the Muslim horde and getting most of his men killed in the process. Yes, I know he did it to buy time for the peasants to escape, but still, I wouldn't place this as the highest example of his capability to lead men into battle. So, King Baldwin, since that is the extent of his experience, would you please reconsider another role for Balian?
Would you marry my sister Sibylla were she free of Guy de Lusignan?
Okay, that's it. Fuck this movie. I'm sorry, but if this movie is not going to take itself seriously, then why should I care? This movie clearly doesn't give a shit because these characters aren't acting like real people. Medieval society would never accept a bastard as king. The social stigma in doing so would result in political upheaval and outright civil war. And yet, they expect us to accept this without question. I can't understate how much Balian manages to aggravate me and fascinate me at the same time as a character. Like, 1 minute he doesn't know what a Muslim is.
Who are those men?
Muslims. Saracens.
And yet, somehow, despite his previous career as a blacksmith, knows the process of agriculture and successful irrigation in a land and climate he is not familiar with.
Stop! Stop!
And also with no training whatsoever, knows the logistics on defensive siege warfare.
Mark 400.
400. 400!
And has the balls to give strategic advice to a military council on how to fight Saladin, despite the fact that he has never fought a real battle in his life.
No. If you must have war, this army cannot move away from water. You have a chance to hold the city. But if you move out against Saladin, this army will be destroyed, and the city left defenseless.
When I wish a blacksmith to advise me in war, I will tell him.
Hopefully, it's clear by now why it's so hard for me to buy into this bullshit. They can't do a fish out of water story and have the main character have all the skill sets of the historical figure they're based on. You see, the real Balian of Ibelin would be able to do all this shit because he was born in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He was also a nobleman by birth and had an extensive military background fighting the Muslims. By making him a blacksmith and bastard, they severed any credibility this film might have had in telling this amazing story. Balian's deeds not only seem improbable, but by the simple change, impossible. You know what the worst thing about Kingdom of Heaven is? It's boring. And it shouldn't be boring because it's centered on one of the most fascinating periods in history. We have a flat, boring protagonist who has to be told what his moral convictions are instead of just discovering them for himself. We also have one-dimensional, cartoonish villains with no real conviction or motivation other than simply just because they're evil.
I am what I am. Someone has to be.
And so we end up with an historical epic with a clairvoyant disregard of its own history, choosing to endow 21st century morals on 12th century characters. The thing is that, when I look at history, I see it as a testament to humanity's greatest triumphs and worst crimes. We cannot celebrate one half and ignore the other, or worse, change details about that half for the sake of appearing politically correct today. These things happened and there is nothing we can do about that. The only responsible thing we can do is to learn from our past mistakes. Otherwise, they will fade into obscurity and pose the risk of us having to repeat them again. Well, that about wraps it up. My name is Nick Hodges, and thanks for watching, History Buffs. And remember, if you like the show, help the channel grow. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, and let me know in the comments section what you thought about Kingdom of Heaven. And of course, what historical film should I review next? Until then, I'll see you next time.